Okay, so this is sort of my review video, the study session. There was low attendance, and that was on my part because, bad weather should have accounted for that. So, like, to make up for that, I decided I was gonna have this sort of lecture video, give you some examples, explain sort of the ins and out of this reflection and what you should be looking for, and sort of give you like a brief example of like how I would analyze the primary source, Lieutenant Nunn, and like start sort of some essay reflection on that. So first, as you can see right here, the week 5 is when your reflection is due. It is of Lieutenant Nunn, and the question right here says, "What does the life of Antonio Catalina de Rosso tell us about the individual and society through their transgendering, cultural performance of gender, and imperialist attitudes and actions? What was expected of women and men in the Spanish Empire? Were expectations always rigidly followed? What difficulties face those who challenge gender roles and assignments?" So right off the bat, what you want to do with this is sort of establish what you want your theme or perspective to be of. And so right off the bat, when I'm looking at this, the first thing I see is like this society, right? And it's like, all right, what is about like her being a transgender and transgendering through the colonies and all that had to deal with Spanish society. So like that's something that I would try to focus on and have sort of a theme and sort of like make sure I talk about sort of like the culture that Spanish religion has and like the influence it has on the society. Talk about the ways that like in modern times we see sort of this sort of transgender and with religion you could bring onto that. You can bring in all these different sort of aspects and ideas. And so like I would want to focus on that and also like when you think about this question, think about like other ways you can do it as well, like through some of the other questions there are things like that that helps you sort of like get in the right mindset and sort of up how you want to approach the question. Um, so since we sort of like broke down the question a little bit, what I want to do is sort of show you an example right now of what I would do. So for those who haven't read, basically the brief synopsis I can give you right off the bat is Catalina started off, she was becoming a nun, didn't want to become a nun, ran away. Um, that's where she transitioned to a man, started living life as a man, started gaining benefits that she wouldn't have as a woman, started doing things in society as a man, started gambling, killing, murdering, and then each time she would commit a sin, she would run away to some new place. And she kept going, and then eventually she managed to touch down at one place and was like developing herself. Then she came in conflict with another citizen. They had beef. And then later on, she found the citizen again, slashed his face after they threatened him at the time. And then they ran away, and then that person that they slashed came back to find them. Then once they found them, they started fighting, and then Antonio murdered him. And so then the sheriff was like, "Oh, you're under arrest." But then there was a bishop there who was like, "Let me talk to him." And as the bishop was talking to him, Antonio confessed that he is actually, in fact, a she and went on about this. And sort of that's what I wanted to focus on right now is sort of like that interaction with the bishop. So as we can see, like right here, this quote that I'm highlighting, the daughter, he said, "My doubt is gone. I believe you now, and I shall believe from this day on whatever you may choose to tell me. I esteem you as one of the more remarkable people in this world and promise to help you in whatever you do and to aid you in your new life in service to God." So right off the bat, when I was talking about like the sort of the societal thing with religion and how it perceives like transgender and people who identify differently in sexuality like that, I think that quote would be perfect for this in this instance. So if we can go over here to sort of where I started going off, what initially start off is bringing in some context from what we were learning in the class, right? You want to relate this somehow to back to what we're doing. So I start off, right, the Spanish society during the 17th century is engulfed with Catholicism and everyday life seemed to have followed the same theology. After coming from a period of strict religious intolerance towards other religions, I guess what I was trying to say. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I see what I'm saying. All right. After coming from a period of strict religious intolerance towards other religions, would there be this strong ideal of intolerance to those who contradict these Catholic beliefs? Right. So what I want to do is focus on this intro for a second, real quick. So we'll just move that down. So what I'm essentially doing is sort of setting it up like a theme, right? So I'm setting up like, okay, we can see from what we've learned that Spanish are intolerant towards Muslims and Jews, right? They've gone and sort of purged all the other religions, and they've been focusing solely on creating this sort of utopia of Catholicism. But what I want to do is then contradict that idea is like what happens to the sinners within Catholicism, right? What happens to those who are committing crimes and doing all these things and opposing Catholicism from within? And right off the bat, we see sort of like sexuality is one of the things that could be as like deemed as a sin, right? How do you contradict, like that could be something that contradicts this sort of ideal utopia of Catholicism. And so to me, I've thought like this quote of like the interaction between the bishop and Antonio or Catalina would be perfect to fuse together to then see the contradiction and the acceptance, right? How do they go together when they shouldn't, right? Because we see Spanish society at this time being so intolerant. You would think they would be intolerant to sins. And so that's sort of that question, right? I'm posing this theme of what is intolerance within the society, right? So I then continue after that. I go, though for Antonio slash Catalina de Rosa, that is not the case as they contradicted Catholic beliefs, but yet was still accepted and praised as a Catholic for their religious devotion, right? And then I include the quote that I just said, the daughter, he said, my doubt is gone. And then this right here is my in-text citation. I don't know if that's correct. I just assumed that that would be correct. I was going to talk to Professor Alves about that later. So this is what I would do. This is APA format. But then again, I'm going to go back and double check this for y'all. And then so after you embed your quote, what you want to do after that is then sort of analyze that quote, right? You want a how and a why statement, how that quote impacts your theme, and then why that quote is important to your theme. So right here, I says this displays that even though Antonio slash Catalina was directly opposing Catholic traditions by committing various sins, she was still accepted by the bishop because of her devout attitude she had long established as a child from learning to become a nun. So what I did there was highlighted the how. I highlighted how Catalina or Antonio was accepted into this Spanish society through the bishop and through her devotion that she learned as a child to a nun, right? And then as we can see, I included that as well, like this sort of devotion, or is it right here, this underline right here, it says, and that's what more, they had found me to be intact, a virgin. So after she was searched, because she told the bishop to search her to confirm that she was a woman, in fact. And so they've also found out that she was a virgin. And there, that's like that devout Catholicism, right? That purity, and like with nuns, they're not supposed to, fornicate and do all these things. They're supposed to remain pure. And so that's why the bishop was like, oh, my doubt is gone. I believe you now. You have my trust. And so from there, we see that the bishop is forgiving the sins. One, in fact, she murdered. One, she also was transgender for a while. The bishop is forgiving all these sins just because of her devotion, right? Like directly contradicts Spanish society at the time, right? Because Spanish society is all about intolerance and having this one true ideal, this utopia that I mentioned earlier and alluded to. But yet again, we see in this it's completely off the rails, right? Like Catalina or Antonio was doing all these, sinful things. You would think you would be punished for them, but yet you have not been punished. In fact, you've been accepted. You've been accepted because you are so devout. Why is that devotion important, right? And so I want to go on this idea more like of devotion. Why is that important to contradicting the intolerant Spanish society? Um, so then after that, I go, the bishop saw a purity to Catholic religion and decided to overlook his sins to a devout nature. Like I've been talking about, sort of these ideas, right? The devotion doesn't contradict the Spanish society, blah, blah, blah. With a society that was consumed by intolerance, why are the Spanish, able to look past the sins of those who are devout Catholics? Again, posing these questions to help boost my theme and boost this perspective I have, right? I'm focusing on Spanish society and how they were intolerant, but now they will be tolerant to these sins and going back. And then after this, the acceptance of Antonio Catalina highlights that Spanish society were only intolerant to those who opposed Catholicism. And if you were Catholic, they would be willing to forgive your sins, right? This is my interpretation of it. I'm saying here in this instance that, okay, if you're not Catholic, you're getting booted by the Spanish. But if you were, you're able to do a lot more and have a lot more freedom. And then I would later, if I wanted to, go on that idea of freedom and talk about the Spanish society and things like that. But then going back to this question, right? So I'm talking about the society, and there's other questions you could add onto it. And then if you're talking about society in a sense too, you can also talk about gender norms. You can talk about how it was easier for her to be successful as a man than it was a woman, right? And talk about these sort of patriarchal ideologies in the late what 16th 17th like late 16th early 17th century. You can talk about that fusion as well, bring that into the societal aspect of it. And I wanted to focus on the society thing because I have a background in sociology, so to me it's fascinating to look at things through a sociological lens. But then if you have other lenses you want to look through as well, that's go ahead, do it, because that's when you're analyzing primary sources, that's what it's all about. Like these lenses, you have social, economic, political, militaristic, right? You have all these different lenses you can sort of look through and analyze these sources. And so that's what I would recommend doing with this is so you read part of the text, right? Break it down. You can break it down. So I took this one small snippet and I broke it down into this big ideology of society, Spanish society, and how you could be devout but still be sinful, right? And so you can break it down, you interpret it. Analyzing primary sources is all about perception and interpretation. You want to be able to interpret, but you also want to be able to perceive it in your own way. And also remember, there is no right or wrong answer when you're doing this. There's only interpretation and perception. So it's how you perceive it and how you interpret it. And but make sure you have the facts to back you up, right? So that's why when I wrong one. That's why yeah, when I did it, right, I included like the context that we've been learning in the class through the Spanish society being intolerant, right? We have the conversos and the Maurisos, basically telling the Jewish you have to convert or die. Same with the Muslims, right? They have this strong ideology to prevent them from imposing that Catholic utopia. Um, so yeah, when you're looking at it, that's what you want to do. You want to break it down, interpret it, do it all that. And the other thing I want to do is I want to show y'all an example of my reflection I did for Professor Alves in his other class. I got A on this. And so like if you were just curious about how to set up your reflection, what to do, things like that, I thought this would be a great way so I can break this down a little bit to show you to you guys, show you my thought process a little bit. And so you can see the structure, the flow, things like that. So for our question, it was talking about sort of the Aztecs and those early indigenous civilizations, about this cosmic vision they had, which was sort of this um, equilibrium, I would say, of blending culture with sort of justification on why they would do things. The cosmic vision was sort of like these deities, and they had to appeal to them to essentially ensure their survival past their inevitable end. And their inevitable end essentially was they feared that after a 52-year cycle, which is the combination of the lunar and solar years, that there wouldn't be another cycle after that. So they were always fearful of that. So they looked up to the gods and wanted to make sure they pleased the gods, things like that. And so what I did with this is I took that idea of, this cosmic vision and this, sort of cyclical nature that these ancient civilizations had, and highlighted how they were cohesive, but when they introduce greed, you disrupt that cohesion. And so I had a theme of essentially greed. I wanted to focus on the more that these empires expanded and tried to justify their expansion, the more they disrupted their cohesion, the more we saw they started to disappear. They had more natural disasters. They had more revolts. It was harder for them to develop as a civilization, right? So as this first part is all my introduction. So I basically introduced this idea, like what is like without death in our society. We have these motifs of out with the old and with the new, talking about that cyclical nature, right? And so we can go on. And then I start, like I mentioned in my last video, I'm very Socratic, so I always like asking questions when I analyze, because to me it helps me set up the theme I want. Um, so there's a lot of questions here, basically setting up my theme. But the main thing I want to highlight here is sort of my thesis. I think it's this. Where is it? Mm. So sort of starting right here. So this with this uncertainty of how the Mexica and the Nahua civilizations would continue, that constant need to build and expand to prevent the inevitable is what eventually led to the demise of the Mexica and other civilizations before. Their greed disrupted their cohesion that the cosmic visions brought to the civilizations. So this right here is my sort of thesis in a sense. I'm saying that this constant need to go and expand and build is what led to them eventually starting this cyclical nature, right? They one civilization would fall, the other rise off the ashes of that civilization, but that civilization they got greedy, they fell, right? So you have this cycle of rise and fall. And then again, how does greed disrupt that cohesion, disrupts that cosmic vision? Um, and this part right here, honestly, I didn't need it. I just kept writing, and Professor Alvarez mentioned that, and he gave me some feedback on that as well, and I kind of figured. So like then again, that's where I assumed I probably got some points taken off, right? So sometimes writing too much is not the best, right? So make sure when you have your ideas, you sort of sum it up and don't go too much in detail. And that to me is where I fall victim sometimes. I add too much detail when I write. Um, but yeah, so then I started off sort of addressing this inevitable end. I started describing why were they fearful in the first place, right? I'm talking about this fear of the inevitable. But what is the inevitable, right? So I'm starting from the very beginning, right? So this is how you structure it and you start this flow. So I mentioned the inevitable end, blah, blah, blah. And then I go to sort of the first major civilization that has a lot of roots in all the other civilizations during this time, right? The Olmecs. And so I started explaining sort of how Olmecs were, constantly greedy, but more in a positive sense. Their greed was trying to expand their culture, religion. And by this greed, they were able to set up this framework for other civilizations to then develop themselves and go on from that. So then I basically, this is what this paragraph asked is, and then here, what I did was sort of talk about how greed was negative in a sense, right? So this one was talking about greed in a positive sense. This one here is now greed in a negative sense, right? They got too greedy. They eventually, the elites sort of started punishing the peasants and the commoners more and more for more money, things like that. That made the people upset, so they revolted, right? Their greed got the best of them, and they got their civilization was destroyed. And then I then talked about how sort of that destruction started the cyclical nature, right? You had the next civilization, which was the I have it here somewhere, the Teta, where is it? It's like Teta something. Oh well, but it was another one. Then it was the Toltecs, right? Then the Toltecs eventually inspired the Aztecs to come to power. So right here, I include this quote where it's like with this destruction, the Toltec civilization itself built on the foundations of earlier advanced cultures in turn because became a front for which other cultures would draw, right? And so right here is my transition from talking about these ancient civilizations to now the modern civilization. At the time, Aztecs were modern, so I'm speaking in that sense of modern, not like today modern, right? And then I go and I explain this quote, right? I said the framework was that was alluded earlier is in full effect with the Mexica and Nahuas. This foundation of culture that others can draw upon is what will help the Mexica create cohesion, which allows them to become a prominent figure in Mesoamerica, right? And through their prominence, it's established like the Olmecs through spreading culture and religion, but instead forcibly pushing their ideals through conquest. And I start talking about this Aztec nature of always wanting to expand and push, right? And that greed, right? Right here, I said their greed then became their justification to the gods to help prevent the inevitable, right? So to them, they thought if they sacrificed more, they would then be fine with the gods, as the gods would basically bring peace upon them. That's what they thought their cosmic vision was, but in fact that greed was what led them to their downfall. And so I go on and continue basically like that. But what you want to do is why I'm showing you this is so you want to have structure and order and you want to have a flow. So I started off basically describing, all right, here's the inevitable end. Here's the first civilization. Here's then how that civilization led to the Aztecs, and here's how that Aztecs greed led to their demise. And so I'm bringing in all these ideas, focusing on cosmic vision, focusing on that cyclical nature, right? Hitting those major points that Professor Alves wanted in his reflection question he had, but then also talking about my own perspective and ideology in it as well, and bringing in my theme of greed, right? So I'm combining all these elements, and you want to show that fusion along with structure and order. Um, so that is basically what my study session was going to be. I was probably going to do the same exact thing. And I kind of did what the people who did show up. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to email me. I will be more than happy to help. I can also, if you still are struggling with this primary source and like how to fully analyze it, like I was mentioning, email me. We can set up a one-on-one. I can kind of like go more in depth on it. We can have like a passage and sort of break it down, and I can explain all these things. But I hope this helps. Again, have any questions, please feel free to email me.